Great, so welcome to those of you joining us. Great to welcome you to this webinar. We'll kick off in a couple of minutes, or a minute in fact, to hear about these vital vultures and why we should care about them. Interesting creatures for sure. So yeah, do pop your where you're joining us from in the chat. We'd love to know. Nice to welcome people from all sorts of different places around the world, with both Wildlife Vets and VetCT being global companies. So great stuff. It has just gone 2 o'clock, so I will kick off and yeah, just say thank you all so much for joining us. And we're delighted to be hosting this webinar with Wildlife Vets International, who we've partnered with in a sort of charity partnership to support the great work they do, providing veterinary expertise and input to conservation projects, supporting endangered species all around the world. A little bit about VetCT and what we do. Let me just see if I can advance my slide. There we go. So those of you who haven't heard of VetCT, we're a global team of veterinary specialists providing advice and support services to veterinary teams all over the world through teleradiology, which is the remote reading of CT, X-ray, MRI and nuclear imaging. Across all species, and also providing teleconsulting support, so advice and support on case management from multidisciplinary specialists. We also have a very strong education arm, and education is a real core thread to everything we do, both through bespoke education services and diagnostic imaging courses, supporting university faculties with virtual locums, and also providing educational content. So if you want to find out more about VetCT, you can scan the QR code on the screen, or you can use the URL that's shared on the page. So without further ado, I will hand over to the Executive Director of Wildlife Vets International to talk to us about vultures. If you have any questions for Olivia throughout the talk, do please go ahead and share those with us through the chat and the Q&A. And I will be very happy to field those to Olivia either during or at the end of the talk. We'll have a Q&A session as well. So I will stop sharing my screen and yeah, hand over to you, Olivia.
Thank you very much, Liz. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And while I sort out this presentation, I would like to thank you, first of all, for... I'm going to thank you actually once I've started this slideshow. Okay, so I'd like to thank VetCT for giving us this opportunity, but also to thank them for partnering with us. VetCT and WVI are very similar in our outlooks and our vision and our values, and because education goes all the way through WVI and what we want to do. We've been set up to transfer the knowledge from experts that are often in the West in zoological collections and conservation big conservation organisations and universities, and transfer their specialist knowledge down to the conservation organisations, their staff and the in-country vets that they work with, so that they have the latest up-to-date information. And we work across the world with a number of species, and this week we are championing vultures as part of the of wider ecosystems. This is part of the Big Gives Green Match Fund, and all this week, well, until Thursday noon, sorry, all donations are doubled, which is why we are championing them particularly this week. Liz mentioned that I've just been away on a trip to India and Nepal where I've met a lot of the partners that I'm going to be talking about. And at the end of the talk, we'll tell you how we're going to help complement the bigger organisations that already have done and continue to do a vast amount of work with these species. Right, let me just sort this out. So we always work in collaboration with veterinary professionals and conservation organisations, and we want to be able to transfer this. Well, the ultimate aim is to ensure that we have a world where wildlife survives and flourishes, and that this is increasingly becoming to include people and the role that humans have in this world where wildlife flourishes. And we do this through training vets and the conservation organisations that they work for. Firstly, to recognise that disease is a serious threat to wildlife, and that is confounded by the fragmentation of populations into small isolated populations. And the wildlife trade, habitat loss, and now climate change are all increasing the probability that disease is going to have a serious impact on population numbers. So while the aim is to save the species in order to keep biodiversity and restore the balance of the world we live in, our little piece of that puzzle is about wildlife medicine and ensuring that those on the conservation front line have the skills and the knowledge that they need. So we work in this area, the interface between humans and wildlife. When I was in India, I became very apparent to how locked in we were in a tiger reserve, and how locked in they are. While that tiger reserve was made up of different kinds of land, so there were national parks and there were community lands and there was private ownership, all connected together into one tiger reserve. Outside that, it's very difficult for the tigers to move between there and the next tiger reserve was 100 kilometers away. They've got a huge number of threats to go through, including roads and farms and urban areas. So I'm going to talk predominantly about vultures in Asia. The story is very dramatic in South Asia. Vultures are under threat in Africa as well, less so in Southern America and South America, although the biggest of all the birds of prey species, the condor, or the vulture species, the condor has made a remarkable recovery thanks to a lot of effort from a number of people over there, and that knowledge has fed into this story, which you'll see as I go through it. The other reason why we're looking at vultures is, or the main reason actually, because they're a great example of how a single taxa, or even this is mainly three or four species can have an extremely profound effect. The removal of those taxa, will have a profound effect on the rest of the ecosystem and ecosystem health, but and which of course includes humans and human health. But first of all, I probably need to change your perception of vultures. They don't have a huge amount of respect. Most people think disgusting, and they probably think of something that looks like this: a naked head with a really big, sharp looking, vicious looking beak, all covered in blood, with blood dripping everywhere. I actually had to search quite hard on the internet to find a picture like this, because this bird has literally just pulled his head out of a carcass. It'll be a species that eats the viscera, so that they're very bloody anyway. You can see that he has actually got feathers on his head, so that it dispels that myth. They're thought of, because they deal with dead bodies, they're thought of as the harbingers of death, and lots of people think that they cause deaths too, but they haven't actually got the right equipment. Those beaks are very, very strong. They can crush bone. They're very sharp. They can cut sinews off the bone, but they're not very good for grabbing. If you look at species that grab with their beaks, they have a very different type of bill, and they also don't have the sharp claws and the kind of curved toes that you see of other birds of prey that do catch their prey with their feet. These vultures very much have flatter feet. They're made for walking around and jumping and bouncing around. They're not designed for grabbing onto prey very quickly. And they are, after all, a great example of how a single species or group of species has a profound effect on the rest of the ecosystem and even human health. So I'm going to bust a few more myths about vultures, and hopefully by the end of them you'll be as committed to them as the rest of us are. So here's a whole pile of vultures around a carcass. None of them have got bloody heads. This is a picture from a release of captive reared and captive bred vultures. You can see some of them have got little rucksacks on their back. You can I'm not sure if you can see me pointing. Oh, hang on, I can do that. Laser pointer, there we go. This vulture here and up here and down here, they've got little packs on their back that are radio transmitters, satellite transmitters. So once they're released, they can be followed and we can find out what they're doing. These were released from a site in Nepal that I went to about 2 months ago, and I was lucky enough to see the release of the last 10 vultures that Nepal has in captivity. They were hilarious. I've never seen vultures up close before. I thought they were absolutely hilarious. So you'll see the cage later, but they have a release cage, and then that is on the edge of the vulture restaurant where safe food is put down for the wild, and those that have already been released, they get fed regularly there. And so the wild birds the captive birds have had a chance to socialize with the wild birds before they're released. They're very sociable. The ones that were in the wild were all hopping around the bottom of the aviary like a kind of group of sort of 3 or 4 year olds at a birthday party, all trying to get the attention of the adults that was there, who was about to bring out the carcass. And when the keeper did bring out the carcass, there was all sorts of squabbling and flapping, and they were all biting each other and shouting at each other. And then one vulture would grab a bit and then run off, and then about 6 of the others would decide that this tiny morsel that this one vulture had was what they wanted, and so they ran after it. They always have a number of species that come in, and I'll explain in a minute as to each species has a different role to play in cleaning these carcasses. But one of the big griffon vultures came down, and because they're much bigger than these white rumped vultures here, they're very much more dominant. And one of the cheeky juvenile white rumped vultures dared to try and grab this morsel off this huge griffon vulture, and it was absolutely hilarious. He ended up, he kept going in there even though he was being shouted at and being pecked at by the bigger bird. And eventually the bigger bird just sort of walked onto him to kind of physically push him out of the way, because he was so in his face and being so cheeky. And the juvenile ended up on his back with his wings out and his feet up, which is a very kind of defensive, dismissive behavior for the vultures to do. You see them when they're squabbling with each other, that's the end is when one of them's on their back going, okay, all right, you win. They're really characterful. I hadn't really appreciated how amusing they are to watch. So if you ever get the opportunity, I'll definitely go and watch it. It's much better than Gogglebox. So to go to the species that we find in South Asia, these are the most numerous, the oriental white rumped vultures. They nest in colonies and trees. They're the most widely spread of the vultures. There were literally 40 million of them across sort of the area we're talking about is Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh and India. And their role is they eat all the viscera, so all the innards and the heart and the guts and the liver, most importantly. And they are the ones that are, yes, most there. They will then move on to the meat somewhat afterwards. So they're critically endangered. There are literally a handful of thousands of them left these days. The long-billed vulture and the slender-billed vulture, which you'll see in a minute, are both very similar, but they nest on cliffs rather than on the trees. And there's quite an interesting study phenomenon, an ecological phenomenon, where if you have too many long-billed vultures nesting on the cliffs near a white rumps vultures colony, they will have an effect, and they will reduce the number of white rumps vultures that there are nesting there. But it works the other way around as well. So they kind of keep each other, the numbers in balance. If they're in balance and they're both thriving, but if you get more than one than the other, then it has a detrimental effect already on the other species. So which is quite important to think about that when we think about OneHealth and about the balance between the different species, that all these species are there to keep each other in check and in balance. This is a slender-billed vulture, also critically endangered. These three species were the ones that were hit worst by the dramatic decline in the 1990s. And you can see that he hasn't got, this is a juvenile, but he hasn't got that much hair, that many feathers on his head. And one of the reasons why they don't want to have too many feathers on their heads is because they will get it covered in blood and bits of meat, and they don't want it to get infected. But they also think that these naked heads are really important for regulating temperature within the vultures. If you think that they're soaring very, very high altitudes, it'll be very cold up there, to being down on the ground, there's a payoff, and they can fold their necks right back into their bodies to keep warm, and then bring it out to cool down as they come down into the cooler climates. So he's quite a handsome creature, but he is quite sort of disheveled looking, and he's definitely what they think of as like, this is the most scruffiest of all the species. They're also probably the least aggressive of all the species that you would find around a carcass, which is called a wake, when they're all on top of each other. So I mentioned about the griffin. This is the Himalayan griffin as opposed to the Eurasian griffin that we'd get in southern Europe here. They are enormous birds, as you can see from this one here has just been released about 2 or 3 weeks ago in Bangladesh. They have a recovery, more than a sort of captive breeding program. They have a rehabilitation program, quite a successful rehabilitation program. And they have rehabilitated and released 250 vultures since 2014 as part of their ongoing efforts. So each range state has got a slightly different issue as to the threats to the species. So this species actually is classified as near threatened rather than the other three, who were critically endangered. And he's near threatened because his role in breaking up the carcasses, eating the carcasses, is actually to eat the sinews and the sort of tougher flesh of the carcasses, and that was where less of the poisons were. So I don't want to give the reason away as to why they declined so much, but the reason why these weren't affected so much in the decline was because of what they eat. Right, this is the red-headed vulture. This is like the king of the vultures in India and these areas. The red-headed vulture, known as the king vulture or the Raj Gidda. Raj is the Hindu word for a king. They are very low in number anyway. They are pretty solitary, unlike the other species that we've looked at. So you'll see them alone or in pairs. They're pretty shy. They nest in tall trees, and that's one of the reasons why they're endangered, is because there aren't many tall trees for them to nest in. And they're the ones that eat they've got very sharp beaks to open up the tough hides, and will eat the gristle on the end of the bones and the very strong tendinous bits. Those big beaks can exert a huge amount of power. And then we have the little Egyptian vultures, and these are quite often called a pharaoh's chicken. They are very much the smallest out of the vulture species that we're looking at. And you can see they've got a completely different type of beak. They sort of, it's small and pointy. It's not nearly as powerful as the other beaks that we've been looking at. And this means that they're picking at the bones. They're going to be picking off those little bits that are left on the bones, and they'll be picking up morsels that have been thrown off by the bigger vultures. Then they won't be right in the middle of that wake. They'll be around the periphery, and they just kind of potter around the bigger birds. They're pretty good at this species are pretty good at living alongside people. So they are, well, actually all of them are pretty good. They are and very, very well tolerated, because they seem to be the species that kind of clear up. And lastly, I'm going to tell you about this beautiful looking vulture called the bearded vulture, but you only find them up in the mountains in the Himalayas, and actually we have them in the European mountains as well. But they're pretty solitary. They nest on cliffs and in trees on the mountainsides. And what's remarkable about these species is that 90% of its diet is made up of bone and bone marrow. They are like the last vultures that come into a carcass, and if the bones are too big, they can't break them up, then they will actually fly up into the sky and drop them onto the rocks below so they can get at the marrow. All vultures have very acidic stomachs, but these guys have the most acidic stomach at about pH 1, and they can dissolve bone within 24 hours. Which is quite extraordinary that I know that bone marrow is very nutritious, but that they would bother eating the bone as well. So that kind of makes up our species diversity, and every species has got a role in removing the carcass, and clearing up the carcasses, because they basically are the rubbish dump, the garbage collectors of our natural ones in our ecosystems. This comes from a fantastic video, a short sort of 5-6 minute TED talk on why vultures are really cool and how they vomit acid and are nature's garbage collectors. And I've chosen this particular still out of it because it shows a carcass here that's right next to a water source, and I couldn't find a picture of that anywhere else. And the reason why that's really important is because if this antelope, I think that's supposed to be, because I think this is based in Africa, if it's got anthrax or TB or brucellosis or a number of other diseases, and it dies and it's near a water source and it just decomposes, then all its pathogens that it has will go into the water and then will contaminate a vast number of other animals. And vultures will come down and clean a carcass within half an hour of them all coming together, and within hours of an animal dying, you'll have a completely clean carcass, and all the diseases that animal was had in itself, or that died of, will be destroyed by these incredibly acidic stomachs in the vultures. So really, really important ecosystem function role that they play within the ecosystem function. So in India, because of the Hindus really revere cattle, they don't eat them, but they have a lot of them. And in the cities, just outside the cities or the villages, you would historically take your carcass or your cow, but sort of on its last legs, to these through these cattle rubbish dump areas, and or the carcass, and there are millions of vultures that would be there ready to completely clean up these carcasses. So this is in 1980 in Delhi, and you can just see how many vultures there are. So it's a bit like pigeons in Trafalgar Square here. Nobody really noticed vultures, took any notice of them. There were always vultures. They knew that they played this really important role in the ecosystem, in clearing up dead bodies, and in India, and less so, but also in Nepal, Bangladesh and Pakistan, they have this really important role for taking away the cattle carcasses. And in some parts of this world, you get the Zoroastrians, and so they were also cleaning the bodies, in the human bodies, in the towers of silence. And this is what happened. So between 1992 and 2000, the numbers absolutely crashed by 50% every year. You were looking at a total of 40 million vultures in this area, and then the next year there'll be 20 million. So this is just one particular area that this study is taken from, but you can see how quickly that decline happened. No other bird species has survived a crash in numbers like this. So you can imagine it took a few years for people to understand that the numbers were dwindling, because when you see a lot and then you just see lots, there's still quite a lot of animals there, and they weren't necessarily seeing dead bodies, and so it was very difficult to see, to really realize what was happening. Fortunately, this guy, Dr. Prakash, is an avid birder at the Bombay Natural History Society, and he did do he did road transects and collected this data to demonstrate that actually there was quite a serious problem. And then the problem came of how to find out what it was. So while it took them about 7 years to figure out what it was, and in that time, India also saw this explosion of feral dog populations as the number of vultures declined. The carcasses were taking much longer to decay. You had an increase, therefore, in food for species like dogs and rats, and they are very happy to live alongside people. Also, they carry a lot of human diseases. So you've got diseases that the cattle were eating that are not being eaten and got rid of by the vultures. And then now you have an added problem with the fact that dogs carry diseases like rabies, and there are many, many more of them. And with the increase in feral dog populations, they're also beginning to see attacks by those dogs on people and small children, and we've put some of them on our social media throughout this campaign, but you're also beginning to see them hunting wildlife and domestic livestock as if they've now become like the top predator. There are two other issues, one that you can see here. One is that these dead bodies, because they're not being cleaned properly, though they're rotting, and all of that disgusting pathogens are going into the groundwater and are causing pollution. And if they're not being sort of pulled apart and distributed by dogs and kites, black kites, then they are being buried sometimes by people, and again you get that rotting carcasses. You know, a couple is fine, but on the numbers that they're talking about, it's not a good idea. So in 2008, there was a study looking at the number of feral dogs, and there was, as the vulture numbers declined, there was a 5.5 million increase in feral dog populations. And in India, there were an additional 38.5 million dog bites and 47,000 additional rabies deaths. And this study in 2008 was looking at the same period in the vulture decline in the sort of the mid 1990s to the mid 2005, and looking and collecting the data from the human health, those that collect the human health data as well. So while there's no absolute, you can't categorically say that the decline in vultures caused the increase in feral dog population, there was a huge, I think it's mainly because nobody's actually looked at it. There was a huge increase in food availability, and as always in nature, another species comes in to take advantage of that. One of the other things you can see in this picture is the vast amount of plastic that is in this area, and all the cows now have got plastics in their stomach, and they are and it's causing huge health issues for the cows. That's going to be India's up and coming and next problem, is that all their cows are eating plastics, and that is slowly killing them, really horrible, painful deaths. Apparently they aren't able to walk properly, which means they need more painkillers, and so the story is completely cyclic. So when the biologist found out that, or measured categorically that numbers were declining and that there was a huge panic, and the first thing that, because they didn't know why they were declining, was to bring some into captivity to create an insurance population. And the expertise for these captive environments came actually from the UK, from a lady called Jemima Parry-Jones, and a couple of other people in the UK who kept vultures and birds of prey, and together with the information that the South Americans had from the Condor program, created these fabulous huge aviaries where a number of birds can be kept in one place. They can still be as sociable as they would have been in the wild, and then nesting properly and feeding properly. They're flying around to a certain extent. The only behavior that they couldn't really do, obviously, is the soaring behavior, which is impossible to replicate in captivity. So these birds were very well looked after. I mean, people were paranoid about them because they were declining so quickly in the wild, and they didn't know what it was. Were these enclosures protecting them from it? So they were monitored, their health was monitored to within an inch of its life. There's a huge training opportunity here for vets from the UK to go over and help the biologists and some of the vets to learn about vulture medicine. One of the problems we had was that they had to get it right the first time. There was experience within captivity on how to handle these kind of birds, how to double clutch them. So the keepers would take away the first eggs and incubate and hand rear those, and the birds would go on to produce another egg that they would then incubate and rear. There's constant learning all the way along. So they figured out that the chicks that were being hand reared had to have a certain amount of daylight at various phases, a different amount of daylight in their various phases of their growth. Otherwise, they were getting metabolic bone disease. One of the problems that they had was that because they were so numerous, nobody had studied them. So they actually didn't know very much about them. This particularly comes to the kind of biomedical data. So we've had data from other species in captivity, but not this particular species. And that would have really helped when it came to looking for what was wrong with them. Why were they dying in such high numbers? Because they had no kind of normal value. And it's one of the things that we really install in any partner that we work with, that they've got to collect these samples, even though they don't see the point of it. If they've got these endangered animals in their hands to collect the samples, it's the only opportunity they'll get to collect samples from relatively healthy wild animals. So everyone was beginning to tear their hair out as to what it was, and there were studies going on thinking it was an infectious disease studies, and the Zoological Society of London led that, and then the Peregrine Foundation led this study into the toxicity of everything they tried to test, and they were just about to stop, and because they couldn't think of anything else, when they then tested diclofenac, which, as I'm sure you will know, is a non-steroid anti-inflammatory drug found in vulture oil. and is highly, highly toxic to vultures, but actually is toxic to a lot of scavenging birds we know now. And the reason why it hits the white-rumped vultures and the long-billed and slender-billed vultures is because they were the ones that were eating the viscera, so they were eating the liver and the meat, and that's where the diclofenac was being stored within the cattle. So in the top left, you can see there's a team there. This is one of the original teams at Pinyor, which was the first vulture breeding centre that was built in India. These conservation efforts take a huge number of different expertises to come together to solve some of these problems. Keeping them, I've talked about the vet checks that went on, and a huge amount of learning that went on with the Indian vets. This is Nick Masters, who's up here in the top right-hand picture, who's WVI's veterinary advisor, who I went to India with. And he has provided mentorship for a number of Nepalese and Indian vets over the years, and so it was really good to go with him, and he could fill me in on all the backstory and all the little nuances with it. So very successful first phase with the captive rearing and captive breeding programs, certainly in India, and they have begun releasing some. However, they haven't been quite so successful at creating what are called vulture safe zones. So alongside the captive breeding and the rescuing of this population has to go on securing the environment so that released birds don't go out and then be targeted by exactly the same thing that made them threatened in the first place. So these vulture safe zones are areas where diclofenac has not been used, and they have the researchers, the team have gone around and persuaded people that not to use diclofenac, but to use meloxicam instead. In fact, there are lots of other NSAIDs on the market that are less toxic or not toxic to vultures. Unfortunately, there are more coming onto the market that are very like diclofenac. It seems to be a particular issue for this part of the world, why companies are producing vast quantities of NSAIDs when they don't really need them. Is a constant battle really for these conservationists. In Nepal, they have done very much better at making the getting rid of the diclofenac within the environment. It's a different culture, they just do things in slightly different ways, and so they have been releasing birds over the last 4 or 5 years, and as I say, I went to the last release about 2 months ago it was now. So top left, that's a release aviary as opposed to a breeding aviary. It is right on the edge of this vulture restaurant. You can see underneath there's the bones from previous feed meals that the vultures have had. You can see how white and clean they are compared to the carcass that we were looking at that the domestic dog was eating from. Very, very clean, nothing left, no pathogens left. On the top right there, every vulture is numbered and is given a wing tag so that it's large enough to be seen from the ground. You can see the one on the left has got his back feathers on its back are a bit ruffled. That's because his transponder is under his feathers. There have been several different reincarnations of the sort of rucksack or harness that they wear to as they're just constantly improved. So they're more comfortable for the vultures and they continue to do the job properly. Bottom right, you can see there's Nick and one of the Nepalese handlers doing a final health check before the release. So it's all very, very intense, and I think this has been going on for nearly 20 years. So fabulous successes in releases in Nepal. predominantly in India, and Bangladesh and Pakistan haven't released any. Bangladesh have released some, all very, very small numbers. You're talking about under 100 from each centre. They are breeding successfully in the wild, but their reproductive rate is so slow. To double their numbers, would take 10 years. So they have one chick each pair per year. And if we think about the numbers that were dying, it took 15 years to go from sort of 40 million down to a couple of thousand. It will take about 150 years to get back to the pre-diclofenac numbers. Although the numbers in India were probably unnaturally high because of the number of domestic cattle that are put out in the cattle graveyards. It's not all plain sailing, despite the successes that have gone on. We don't really know what new diseases like avian influenza and Newcastle's disease will have on them. They're very naive to predators, and birds have been found dehydrated and very weak and in need of rehabilitation. So the captive element, even if they've all been released, certainly won't be going away in the near future. You can very much see from this example that biodiversity loss is driving emerging diseases. The vultures disappeared and the numbers of rabies instances increased, and there's definitely a link, if not direct, between the two. It is, I think Nick described it to us once as an ecosystem is like a healthy gut in us. So there are millions of microbes in our guts. And if you strip out the biodiversity of that because you're using on antibiotics or something, you bring out the emergence of bacteria that you don't really want. You know, yeasts like Candida and things like that. So I hope that I have put together a really good case of why vultures are your friends, and why we need species that we think are disgusting. We need to ensure that we conserve those as well as the ones that are more charismatic. I've just got a few more slides about fitting this into the much bigger picture of OneHealth. When we talk about OneHealth, or when other people talk about OneHealth, I suppose, quite often it is used to look at the overlap between domestic animal and human medicine, to see how they can learn off each other. It's also mentioned when we talk about zoonotic diseases, so the spillover of diseases like SARS and MERS, Hendra virus, HIV, and of course COVID, from wild populations into humans. But actually the picture is much, much bigger than that, and it includes the health of the ecosystems. And in the last sort of 15 years, there's been research so we can put data to the claims that biodiversity not only ensures ecosystem functions and gives us the bigger benefits of carbon sinks, freshwater, barriers from offshore storms, preventing landslides, etc., etc. But we can demonstrate that by eliminating local biodiversity, we're actually increasing the health risk to ourselves. On our website, we've got quite a good paper, an article, a relatively short article that shows and demonstrates the research that shows that the species that are able to live alongside humans are also the species that are most likely to carry zoonotic diseases. And with a reduction of species diversity, you also get a higher prevalence of pathogens. If you remember at the very beginning, I talked about the effects of the number of oriental white-rumped vultures and who nest on top of the trees, and the long-billed vultures that nest on the cliffs, that there is an ecological balance between the two. They keep their numbers of both of them in check. And that is what bigger biodiverse systems are all about. So they're all about keeping all the species, including the pathogens, all in check, so that not any one or two species becomes dominant, which is when we then begin to find the problems. That is an entire talk in itself, so go and read our article on our website. Thank you very much. So to bring all this back to WVI and what we do, we're looking to get involved with the summer health checks and bring on a new generation of vulture vets, of wildlife vets that have experience in vulture medicine. And one of the tools we have in our books is Operation Avian, which is a conference held over 2 days in January, where Indian, or well, anybody, but it's based in Jaipur, vets and rehabilitators come to learn how to look after birds of prey that are injured during the Uttarayan, or the kite flying festival. And it's we're really excited because it's going to be quite an opportunity to give a talk about vultures and how amazing they are, and why everybody needs to save them, to an audience that possibly aren't old enough to really remember living with vultures. It's been about 20 years since the big vultures numbers have been around, and one of the problems with the program is that this whole generation of people who are now working don't remember vultures being in their environment, and this is one such way that we can combat that. So I hope you've enjoyed our talk, that these lovely naked-headed birds are extraordinary. You're converted to them, and if you donate in the next couple of days, then your donation will be doubled. Thanks very much to the Big Give, who have provided match funding. If anyone's got any questions, then I'd be happy to answer them.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Olivia. Really enjoyed that. Yeah, fascinating creatures, aren't they?
Yeah.
One question I had is, obviously with kind of social species in general, you know, they tend to have quite sort of big brains and be quite intelligent, just because with that sort of social hierarchy. Has there been any kind of work done that you know of into the sort of intelligence of vultures?
Not that I know of. I think there's been so much work having to be done on their sort of biophysiology and medical physiology that they haven't done it. But I was talking to the Indian vet who's going to be heading up this vulture network, or sorting it all out anyway. And he has done a lot of work with vultures in rehabilitation. And he just says, yeah, they're all totally different characters, and they're great. They're very amusing. They're kind of bright, and they pick holes in things that you don't want them to pick holes in, and constantly causing chaos. So they're very childlike in an intelligent and amusing and entertaining kind of way.
Curious
Yeah,
birds.
very curious.
Yeah. And more than curious themselves, and curious for us to look at. Yeah, that's really interesting. And you know, again, the kind of use of something like a non-steroidal, you know, not knowing at the time the impact that some of the medications that we use and prescribe for very well-meaning uses, you know, the impacts that we sort of find further down the line. And interesting that there are kind of alternatives available that don't have those impacts. So
but the irony is that they did all this research. You know, there's a lot of European work has gone into that research for diclofenac and how toxic it is, and is ongoing, because there are more products coming out that are similar. And then the EU authorizes it as a veterinary drug in we've got vultures in Southern Europe. Okay, we don't leave the carcasses out quite as much as the Indians do, but it is having an impact on our own vulture populations in Europe.
Yeah, I think that in itself is a good awareness campaign to the veterinary community.
Yeah, so. I know.
Yeah. Are there any other questions that anybody has? You can just pop them in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute. We are recording, so yeah. But if you're happy to unmute and ask a question, please do go ahead. And just a reminder, I did pop the links in the chat, sharing the article that you were mentioning, and the TED talk as well. I found that one.
I did. It's good. It's really good.
Yeah,
that TED talk. Yeah, that's it. Puking plague busting heroes of the ecosystem. Yeah.
I love that. I mean, what a title. So yeah, we'll be at VetCT will be sharing the link to the double donation as well, and just encouraging people. But yeah, I mean, if anyone attending wants to share that link as well, it's a great way to help raise money to support this this very important work, and the sort of the wider impacts on the ecosystem and human health as well. So I think that looks like we haven't got any more questions pinging up, but a couple of thank yous in there, and a huge thank you from us, Olivia, for today's talk, and also to WVI for the work that you do. And yeah, it's great to continue supporting you in that. So
well, thank you very much for your support. It's been brilliant. So it's always good. So we look forward to doing more. We look forward to the next talk.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, do keep your eyes on the VetCT social media and the Wildlife Vets International social media. We'll have more of these talks coming in the pipeline to showcase some more of the projects that need this vital veterinary work to yeah, help our endangered species. So thank you everyone for joining, and yeah, hope to see you again soon.
Thank you very much, Liz. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.